Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I welcome you to the third and final program of our series entitled The Art of Living, Mindset for the Future. Today's program is one in which we will be discussing particularly the realities, male and female. In order to pursue this subject, I'm very happy to welcome to our program today Dr. William Harper Hauff, who is the Senior Minister of the Spokane Unitarian Church. Our guest is a graduate of the College of William and Mary in the field of chemistry. He also pursued that same academic background with getting his master's and his PhD from Michigan State University. After teaching chemistry for some time and working in chemical research, he returned to college to get his baccalaureate degree in religious ministry from Starr King School. As I indicated, he is presently serving with the Spokane Unitarian Church. He is also the author of a number of journal articles, including subjects such as civil disobedience, revolution, ecology, civil liberties, marriage, and New Age thought. Dr. Hauff, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and we look forward to this interview.
Thank you.
I'm happy to welcome to the panel to question our guest today. First of all, regular panelist Janelle Burke, who is an attorney and also the law clerk for the First Judicial District Court. And I'm also very happy to have on our program, we've had before, Joe Webb, who is the assistant to the president of North Idaho College. And I shall invite Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Well, Dr. Huff, you have mentioned that there are some differences between the sexes in their decision-making, male and female. Can you tell us if you really believe that? And if so, how do you know?
Well, yes, I do really believe that. Of course, we're all aware that there's a certain amount of folklore in that direction, which has, some of which I think is very justifiably come into question in recent years along the lines of men being cognitive and women being intuitive, and it usually goes downhill from there. I think these distinctions, which are often taken, made and taken pejoratively, do point, though, to a real difference between the way that men and women think in general. Not to say that the distinctions are absolute. They're not. There are men that are, I think, much more feminine than the majority of women in their ways of thinking, and vice versa. But in general, there's a fairly large body of research and thought now that would suggest differences in ways of thinking.
And so how do you know that there are differences in ways of thinking? What are they? What are the differences?
I think our first indications actually came about from such things as the differences that show up in the way that men and women respond to things like strokes. For example, whereas men will show certain kinds of damage, like in verbal abilities, on one side of the brain, if that side is affected, women tend not to have those problems nearly as much as men do. I think what has happened, and those are things we've known for a long time, I think what they indicate is that there is some difference in the circuitry, if we want to use that kind of a term. More recently, the studies that have been made point to differences in ways of decision-making, which are more nearly psychological differences rather than anatomical differences.
Wouldn't you find, though, that sometimes it depends on the individual as much as it depends on whether they are male or female?
Oh, you bet. You bet. As I said before, there are men that are much more feminine in their approaches than the majority of women, and vice versa. The differences that we find are more nearly a spectrum, and there's a great deal of overlap between the two.
How much of this do you think is physiological, this difference in decision-making, and how much is learned? How much do we learn the way we're going to behave?
That is really a tough one to answer, because basically you're bringing up the inherited versus environmental effects. And there's no question but what cultural reinforcement has an impact. But I think if we, and here what we have to do is perhaps kind of a thought experiment, to use a term that Albert Einstein made famous. If you think about it, those differences had to originate somehow. Now maybe they simply originated because we looked at one another and realized that we were anatomically different. But I suspect that cultural differences originally came out of real differences having to do with the ways that we think. So, you know, you can't separate them cleanly.
Joe Webb.
Oh, in that context, then, if we are now aware of these physical differences, or physiological differences, does this mean that men cannot learn to be more intuitive, or women learn to be more cognitive? How can we train our brains to be some of each?
It's an excellent question, and I think it's not only important just from the standpoint of being interesting and important in terms of fairness kinds of issues. I think it's important to the very survival of the species. My own sense is that when we look at the culture that we have created, it is, and I doubt that there's too much of an argument about this, predominantly a masculine-oriented kind of culture. It tends to be competitive. It tends to be very heavy on individualism. It is fragmented. And I think we're starting to see that that's producing some real problems, not just in the fact that, that we tend to choose up sides and want to throw heavy weapons at one another, but also from the standpoint that it interferes with our individual relationships. By the same token, I think that women have certain characteristics which are very important to redressing the imbalance that we have culturally at this point. Most of the studies that I've read show that women are much more inclined toward what might be called contextual thinking, toward seeing the whole, whereas men will tend to specialize. Women are more inclined to see the interconnectedness of things. And goodness knows that we need to do that now. I think we're discovering that our very specialization, which in some respects has been has enabled us to be very powerful in certain fragmented ways, is starting to cause us grave problems, both in our political situations, ecologically, and relationally.
Well, to follow up on that, if we tend to call these feminine characteristics, it may be hard to sell the male population on the necessity of looking contextually. How can we make the statement for for the process to take place?
I think of two things, Joe. One is that I think as men find out that there are advantages to being able to think contextually as well as analytically, I think as we realize that there are some advantages there, we will more adopt that kind of mode of thinking. Not that we'll abandon whoever we are uniquely, but that rather we will grow larger. Often enough what people do is they think we're looking at either-or kinds of distinctions. And I think what we need to do now is more and more to move into a both-and mode of thinking. The other thing that I think comes out of this is that we men need to recognize that women have perspectives that can be very useful to us in the world that we have. That up until now we've tended to have a culture that was mostly the way we wanted it. And we valued that. We thought that was the best way to have it be. We are now seeing that that culture doesn't work very well in a whole lot of ways. And I'm not just talking about the fact that women are getting a little impatient with it, as I think they should be, but the fact that it's not working well for us.
I see.
My own sense is that the culture itself is in great trouble, but that it's not in terminal trouble if we will open up and take in the other half of the species.
Can you name some reference material, perhaps, that would be valid for men to be looking at, and women to be looking at, some of the studies that have been made?
One of the most interesting studies that I'm aware of is one that was done. It was actually started in 1975 by a woman named Carol Gilligan, who is a professor at Harvard University now. And she got interested in how women make moral decisions, ethical choices. And so she talked with a number of women, I think it was 27 women, who were making a choice whether or not to have an abortion. And they ended up making various decisions. But the thing that she was looking for is what kinds of things do they look at? How do they go about deciding on a very critical personal issue of this kind? And what she was going to do was apply Lawrence Kohlberg, who's also a Harvard professor, apply his moral scale to these decisions. And what she found out was that her women wouldn't fit, that they ended up about 2 stages lower on Kohlberg's 6-stage scale. This dismayed her quite a good deal because, first of all, she didn't enjoy having the women come out 2 stages lower as moral beings as far as Kohlberg's scale was concerned. She put her study away for a few years. Gradually she realized that Kohlberg had done his work on male subjects. And what he had measured was the way that men make their moral decisions. Not a matter of what's right and what's wrong, it's a matter of what's different here. And he had evolved his scale from that. The thing that she gradually recognized is that the men tended to emphasize principles. You know, what is the higher principle to follow? And what she found her women doing was emphasizing what serves the relationship between human beings best. So that the men were interested in serving principles, the women were interested in enhancing and preserving relationships. And that didn't even show up on Lawrence Kohlberg's scale. She ran into a bit of a problem when she wanted to publish this work because some of the senior professors at Harvard were a little reluctant to have this idea come out. But I think Gilligan's work is the place to begin. She's written a book which is titled In a Different Voice, and it makes very interesting reading for men and women.
Along those lines, Dr. Hauff, you've indicated that there's some ingrained, I guess, cultural attitudes that we also incorporate into our testing system. We've also seen this in relation to black citizens. And oftentimes when we're testing, we are building in biases of one segment of society. And so can I read into what you're saying that as it relates to the formal educational system and the curriculum that we have and so forth, should we take a very serious look at it, not only from ethnic or racial questions, but should we look at it in relation to men and women? Would you propose that we make some significant changes so that we can take advantage of all people in society and the experiences from where they're coming as it relates to life?
I haven't done a whole lot of thinking about it specifically in terms of changes in the educational system, but as I listen to what you're saying and think about it, my inclination is to make a very strong yes response to what you've said. I have no question whatever, but that we do need to become more holistic, more contextual in our thinking. If that is a quality that we're more likely to find in women than men, then we not only need to honor that in terms of fairness, but also in terms of its usefulness to us. I think another area that women have often been credited, and often enough this hasn't been a credit, it's just been a quality that women have been somewhat teasingly accused of having, is being more intuitive than men, and sort of a sixth sense kind of thing. It seems to me that that is a real quality. I don't think it's accidental, for example, that people with psychic characteristics far more often tend to be female than male. And I would suggest that it's not just that their circuitry is somehow or other different, but that maybe they listen better. They pay more attention to all of the signals.
I would like to move in another area that you've already addressed on the program today, and that has to do with some of the cultural and societal problems that we're having, and that you indicate that women in particular are getting to be very concerned about that. I guess there's a two-part question again. What are some of the things that you would like to address on our program where there are such deep troubles and problems, and what could we do in picking up some of these characteristics that some people in our society have to help us correct those? What kind of changes would you suggest?
I think what I would do is refer back to an article that I mentioned this morning when I made my presentation, a column of Georgianne Gyers. that showed up probably 2 to 3 weeks ago. And what Geyer was saying is that the world would be a better place in an international political sense if men could think more like women. Now, this is a sort of title, and that was in the title of the article. It's a sort of title that tends to make men a little bit apprehensive. But I went ahead and read the thing, and what she was saying is that because they do listen better, that women tend to pick up different information and often better information than men do. She was suggesting something that is congruent with Gilligan's work, and that is that that women try to hear what is going on before reacting, whereas we men tend to hear something going on and we're forming up a reaction already. In the one case, there's kind of an inclusiveness. In the other case, there's an attempt to defend one's own position. It might be pointed out as being, at least in some sense, the difference between cooperation and competition, something that I think we probably already knew at a folklore level.
Okay. Janelle Burke.
I would like to look at the world of early childhood and in through the grades. Do you find that it's already it's already known at that point that there are going to be some differences between male and female decision making? Are children already making decisions in a different way just because they're male and female?
The suggestion is that there is child psychologists, child development people, school teachers, and so on will report that that girls tend to, first of all, they tend to talk earlier than boys. They tend to have fewer reading difficulties than boys. Boys, on the other hand, tend to be much more physical and much more boisterous. The suggestion being there that that in each case the sex is emphasizing those qualities that they already have the most of. The boys, being better in spatial abilities, tend to do those things that play upon orienting oneself toward other objects, i.e. other people.
Is this a good thing to have happen, and is it a good thing then to have a class that's predominantly male or female?
No,
or should the classes be more divided equally?
Right. I'm not an educational theorist and wouldn't want to pose as that, but my own feeling is that it's very important to have as integrated a school system as possible, not just racially but sexually too, and that we both be aware of but also be appreciative of whatever differences there are. In other words, celebrate one another's different ways of being, and not do quite so much of, and maybe this is just natural to being a child, but quite so much of, nah, she's a girl, what do you expect? Or boys are always rough and mean, those kinds of things. I think kids will do those inevitably, but I think we need to encourage them that it's okay to be the way you are so long as you're not hurting other people.
So what I hear you saying is if you have a predominance of one sex, you are actually emphasizing that sex's strong points.
Right.
However, might it not also work in the opposite direction, so that if you have a predominance of one sex, that those students are able to fan out a bit and actually experiment with being different, whereas when you have a class that's pretty equally divided, they do take, the males take on their role, the females take on their role, and there's no betwixt and between.
Kind of the cocktail party motif,
right,
where the men gather on one side of the room and the women gather on the other side.
But if you have a full complement of, say, one sex, might it be likely that they'll begin to assume the characteristics of the other sex?
We're going to get, again, probably more into folklore, at least from my standpoint, than what we actually know. I know I spent a year after I got out of public high school in a rural area of Virginia in a military academy. And that was a very boisterously male place. And now perhaps I'm saying more about me than the place when I say this, but I found it an exceedingly unpleasant place to be. It was manipulative and at times very cruel. The high school that I went to was only a few miles away, and it had its problems, but they weren't nearly that extreme. At least in that case, a monoculture made up of men only was not a very nurturing, creative, encouraging place to be. I think it was good for me, but only from the standpoint that I survived it. And I wonder if that isn't what happens in that kind of a setting.
Joelle.
Well, to get back to children, it does seem from what you say that it is very important for young children to have a great deal of a father's time as well as a mother's, and I would say this for both the female child and the male child, because then you can get more of a mix. How do we, well, perhaps I should say, with some of the greater concern of men about their identities, and even in industry and in social groups, men are beginning to examine what they are and how they are. Do you think that there is a possibility that industry and business will come around to accommodating men to the idea that they need to be with their young families too, with work?
I think there is more toleration for that already. 10 years ago, for a man to be a house husband, for example, was something that was almost hilariously funny. I think we tend to accept that. In fact, they're in the daily comic strips. There's even a strip now in which the wife goes off to work and the man stays home and keeps house. He's kind of a comic figure, but he does a pretty good job. You know, the current situation that we have, it seems to me, where which involves the nuclear household, where mom stays home, keeps house, 2 or 3 kids under the roof. Dad goes off and holds down an 8 to 5 job. That's really very recent in terms of our history as a species. That's really quite recent. Prior to that, in fact, in the rural culture that I grew up in, my mom and dad were both farmers. Mom worked out in the field just like Dad did. She couldn't work quite as hard because he was stronger, but she was there and she was an equal partner. And when it came time to clean up the dishes after supper, my dad was always there washing the dishes too. I think that's more nearly the pattern that we had at one time. And then as our modes of earning a living shifted, so that the 8 to 5 kind of arrangement became more important, Dad then became the breadwinner. The home was devalued as a place to be because it was no longer the place where the living was made. Perhaps the biggest tragedy of all was that child raising became not terribly esteemed. And I happen to think that raising children is probably the most important task a culture has. And that when a culture devalues that, it's in trouble, because there's your next generation. So I like to think now, I hope that I see signs that we're shifting back to where both parents are more nearly involved in child raising. Now, it is true that only 7% of our homes fit the definition of a nuclear family. The rest of them are all kinds of variations in between.
You are running through a theme that we've had all week, and Janelle has been with me throughout, well, actually for several weeks on this program. Our guests have been indicating that the most important task in responsibility in society is the rearing of children.
Is that right?
Yes, every speaker has indicated that. And Caroline Bird, who was with us, indicated that we economically have not recognized that fact, and we've said that is a occupation that does not receive any financial reward. And she said we should make some changes. Would you support that position? Would you indicate that we should do some re-emphasis as to economic support for what I believe you believe to be the most important task in society?
Very definitely. I have mixed feelings about the way that we pay ourselves for the work we do now. We're not going to change this very, very quickly, but sometimes I think that wages are the most insidious social institution we have. You know, I work, and in return for that I get a symbol, which we call money, which I then use for other things. I wonder if we wouldn't be better off if we had some sort of a barter arrangement, or even if we didn't keep books quite that tightly. But as long as that is the way we're working now, then very definitely. If money is the measure of the worth of one's work, then I would say that those people who raise children should get money for it.
Janelle Burke.
I'm going to give you a little time to rebut, but what you've said here today seems somewhat sexist to me.
Right.
And so maybe you'd like to explain your position, but on the other hand, always looking for the advantage, perhaps what you're saying is that we should have quotas to overcome, and therefore in business and industry we should have quotas, a certain number of men and a certain number of women decision makers, and that should be the case in business, industry, government, at all levels of decision making. So would you like first to speak to the charge that what you've said today is rather sexist, and then to tell me if you think that there should be quotas?
I would have to hear more about what you mean when you call it rather sexist, because certainly I do speak from a position which is as a male, which whatever innate qualities it may have are there.
I think my concern is in labeling people as being one thing or another, in labeling them as being male or female, and in casting them then in categories which may eventually limit their abilities.
Okay. See, I wouldn't call that sexist. I think sexist implies unfairness, and there's no intention.
But the end result may be that unfairness.
Right. I think just because we acknowledge differences is never a justification for unfairness. The same thing could be used. In fact, during the Civil Rights Movement, there was a period in which we talked about color blindness, feeling that if we acknowledged that one person was white and another was black, that this inevitably was a form of racism because it acknowledged differences which people had, over the course of the centuries, translated into practices that were prejudicial. And I don't think that it's inevitable that differences should lead to unfairness. In fact, I have a suspicion that when we try to remove all differences, it may lead to a kind of cultural blindness, which lets unfairness slip in without us even being aware of it.
Then do you think that there should be quotas? In other words, a certain number of females and a certain number of males involved in decision making at top level government or business decision making?
I have trouble with quotas, but I think that any solution, quote unquote solution, that we come up with is in the beginning going to have to be contrived. And the trouble that I have with quotas is that they are contrived, is that in a sense they do begin by saying, okay, because you are such and such, you may have this job or you may not have this job.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. This would be a very interesting point to pursue, but we're out of time. And on behalf of our staff, Dr. Hauff, I want to thank you for coming and being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today has been Dr. William Harper Hauff, who has closed out our 3-week series that we've been bringing you on the art of living, the mindset for the future. We hope you've enjoyed those programs and our discussion. Again, I want to recognize and thank the North Idaho College Convocation Series that shared their speakers with us on this program, and I also express my appreciation to the panel for their fine questions today. Please have a good week, and I would like to invite you to be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.